All right, everybody. So nice to see all of our people filing in. Very exciting. Thank you, NextGen Nation, for coming in. Welcome to our first breakout session, working with challenging personalities. My name is Megan Pleasant. I'm the Marketing and Communications Specialist for GovBlue. Thank you for being here with us today. We hope you enjoyed the opening keynote session. That was really exciting. But now we're getting into today's breakout session. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's give a quick recap of what you are going to hear about. No matter your agency or role, you've probably run into colleagues who you find are really easy to work with, while others may test your patience daily. This interactive session will give you practical tools to navigate those dynamics with confidence. You'll learn how to identify those underlying causes of workplace friction. It might not be what you think it is, so let's pay attention to those little tips. We'll also cover practical communication techniques that are going to foster constructive and respectful relationships, which we all love to have. By the end, you'll walk away with ideas that you can apply immediately to reduce interpersonal stress, stay focused on that important mission, and create healthier team culture. But I am going to go ahead and go over our housekeeping real quick first, and then we'll dive into the meat of the session. So very exciting. We have additional resources available for you located in the resource tab at the bottom of the screen. So be sure to check those out. Your slide deck will also be there, so you can take that away with you to refresh yourself and share with your coworkers. If you are in need of the closed captioning feature, look for the show captions icon on the bottom of your screen. We hope you don't have technical difficulties, but if you do, please send us a message to that Q&A tab that is also at the bottom, and my colleague Jessica will get your questions answered. In that same Q&A portal, you can ask our expert questions, so don't forget to do that. We definitely want to hear from you and get to know you a little bit better, so drop them in whenever. We have an open chat that's available for you today. Don't be shy. We want to hear from you. Again, you can interact with other attendees here as you have been this morning, so keep connecting, keep networking. And if you miss anything, don't worry about that. We're going to email you the link that has this entire event, including this session right now, so you can, again, recap it, take notes, share it with your colleagues. So let's go into our CPE info real quick. We're going to give you 1 CPE credit for your participation in today's session. There are 3 things you need to do to go ahead and earn that CPE. So stay and participate for the whole session. We know you're going to do that anyway, so that's an easy checkbox. Take all of the polls that we're going to put out there. There's going to be 4. And fill out the post-CPE evaluation, and then you'll obtain that credit. The polls are going to appear on your screen. They're going to pop out, select your response, and then click submit to log your answer. You can also find the CPE evaluation in the resource model on the console or at the resource center in the main event. So if you have any questions, go ahead and pop into there. All CPEs will be emailed directly to you once we confirm you have met all the requirements. So keep an eye out for that email. And now we're going to get into today's speaker because you didn't come to hear me. All right, we're going to go right to Tina Cooper. She is a consultant, trainer, and facilitator. She can tell you a little bit more about herself. The floor is yours, Tina.
Thanks so much, Megan. I appreciate it. I wear a lot of hats these days, but I was telling Megan and Jessica before this started that the favorite one that I wear is that of a coach. So throughout my career, I've really gravitated towards helping people level up their influence and impact on their teams. And I've had the pleasure of working with leaders within a variety of industries, ranging from professional baseball, the NFL, to retail fashion, and yes, the federal government as well. So I had started working as an employee, actually, with the Navy. So I was a Fed myself for some time, and then spent about 20 plus years in federal consulting. So very much familiar with, I think, the environment that you all work in. All right. So that's a little bit about me. Again, I mentioned, I do a lot of different things now, but I think all of it is connected through my hope that I can help people, um, again, become better leaders. All right, so let's do a little quick overview of what we're going to cover together today. We're going to be talking about working with challenging personalities. Maybe not the most fun thing that you'd have to do in a day-to-day, but something I bet we've all encountered, and I suspect is why there's 82 of you joined in this session right now. I hope by the end of this hour, you'll feel more confident about how to talk to these people and forge more productive working relationships. It starts from within. So what you believe really matters and has a way of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's start today by working on making sure that you're in the right frame of mind before we start to engage the other party. Next, we're going to talk about the potential sources of tension. Many times I find that it's not necessarily that people have malicious intent, but people clash because they have very different habits and preferences in the way they work. So we'll touch briefly on these differences, help you spot these so that you can make the adjustments to help make things go a lot more smooth. And then finally, in my experience, avoiding the person that's causing you that tension, it hasn't really helped, right? And sometimes it's not even an option to avoid working with these people. So to improve the situation, it really means that someone needs to take action. And it starts with having the courage to confront the other person and figure out how to get a new beginning. So I'll give you a framework that I found really helpful to prepare for these kinds of conversations. And though it feels like a confrontation, it ultimately keeps it constructive and helps you, make these relationships a lot easier. But before we dive into all of that, I would just like to suggest a few ground rules. So first, I encourage you to participate and ask questions. So feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat, and Megan will try to help me monitor that as we go along, because I want this to be very practical for you. So consider how you would apply these ideas in real situations that you're dealing with, because I'm certain that there'll be others in this session that are dealing with something similar. And secondly, let's also stay curious. If you find yourself thinking, geez, this will never work, I challenge you to consider if maybe not with a particular person, but maybe there's a different situation where something like this might help or might help somebody else. What I'm going to offer you is a buffet of options, not a prescription. So you'll pick and choose what you feel like would be most helpful for you in your specific situations. But that's all I have in terms of ground rules and agenda. Let's go ahead and dive right into our content. So as I mentioned earlier, it kind of starts from within. So I'm just kind of curious as you think about, as you think about the difficult personalities that you work with, the ones that really trigger you. Have you checked into what you're saying to yourself as you encounter these people? Is it something like this? Like, oh my gosh, what a waste of time. Or here we go again. And I want to show you how this starts to really get into a self-fulfilling prophecy cycle, right? Because if your train of thought is already like, hey, this dealing with this person is a waste of my time, think about how you are feeling emotionally in this situation, right? Maybe then you start to feel a little irritated or impatient with this person. And if you are feeling this way, then your behaviors might start to reflect this as well. So perhaps, if you're not paying too much attention, you might accidentally roll your eyes, or you might actually tune out, right? If you're thinking what they're having to say is a waste of time, you might not actually be listening to what they're saying, or you might scoff, right? Those are the behaviors then that you start to exhibit. And when the other person sees that, then their reaction might be one of, well, they're not hearing me, so I'm going to repeat what I just said, right? Or I might raise my voice because now they're starting to get irritated that you're rolling your eyes at them, right? And all this serves is to complete that cycle of, yeah, I knew it. It was a waste of time. They're repeating themselves, et cetera, right? So think about, because this becomes a vicious cycle based on your entering the conversation with this mindset, is there a way to change the narrative so that you don't start to spiral down into this unproductive path, right? Instead of labeling somebody as negative or perhaps being a waste of time or being super defensive, maybe there's a more charitable, interpretation that you can start to have, so that you get into a more productive pattern, right? If you revise this narrative a little bit, perhaps instead of approaching this as, hey, this is a waste of time, maybe again, approach it with curiosity to say, well, I'm curious about their point of view to see where we might find some common ground, right? Anything to keep you from kind of spiraling into this self-fulfilling prophecy would be most helpful. All right. So I'll pause a moment to see if there's any questions or reactions that you have to the mindset aspect of this. Cycle is familiar. Thank you, Ms. Price. Yeah, yeah. I've caught myself doing this sometimes too. I deal with a board of directors in my role as a president of a nonprofit organization. And I replaced somebody that had been in the role for a very long time. And I remember we would clash over budgets, over programming and things like that. And I remember I used to think, oh man, they think I'm a poor person's Zach, who's the name of the previous president. So it wasn't helpful because I didn't show up well. And I experienced this very same cycle. But for me, it really did help to say, well, we're fighting for the same thing. We have a similar mission and passion. Let me see what their real issue is and talk to them. And the other thing I kept reminding myself of is they don't know me yet. They know Zach very well. And so it wasn't always about them either. It was just more, let's change the mindset to say they need to get to know me better. That's all. Right. And Danny, I really like what you said about looking at it on paper. I think sometimes the mindset and what we say to ourselves is going on in the background and we really don't tune into it, but you can say an awful lot to yourself in a very short amount of time that's not supportive. But I think being able to write it down or at least tune into it helps give you that distance to really analyze and see, like, is that actually even true? Because sometimes we'll say stuff to ourselves that is like the worst case scenario, and oftentimes it really isn't. So I really love the interaction here. But again, I think mindset is step one. Get yourself into a space where you're at least able to take in what the other party has to say. Otherwise, there's really no point in starting, in my opinion. All right. So I like the poll question, and let me just pull up the chat window real quick so I can see what our results were. Let's see. Most difficult people. Okay, so it looks like mostly you're dealing with peers that are difficult, and in some cases, the managers, which is always another layer of interesting, right? When you have to go upwards. But I promise you these techniques will work regardless of which level you're working for. But sometimes you will just have to tweak the content of your message, but the framework will apply regardless of the level that you're dealing with. Okay, so what you see in front of you is kind of a tongue-in-cheek title of a book by Thomas Erickson. So he's famous for publishing this book called Surrounded by Idiots. And it talks a lot about the differences that people have in their behavior patterns. And it really does drive, I think, a lot of the root causes for tension in the workplace. So in his book, he starts it by telling a story about a manager that he used to work with. And he was convinced that he was surrounded by idiots. The entire company was staffed by dunces whom he himself had actually hired on, right? So that got the author scratching his head, like, well, what's going on? Like, you're so smart. Why did you hire all these idiots in the first place then? And it goes on to say that this guy was a really, really hard, dark red personality type. So he was of the dominant group where you're known to be somebody who is very fast paced and competitive. You are very comfortable taking risks and making decisions. And he worked with a lot of people who had very different preferences and strengths, right? So you can see on this slide already, there are three other styles typified and described by different colors that have very different ways of approaching work. So for example, if you were a blue type or an analytical, you have a tendency to be a lot more detail oriented. You value accuracy over speed, and you're very deliberative and logical in your approach to work. So if you can think about somebody who is like deeply, deeply dark red, working with somebody who is more analytical, right? There can be that potential for tension because somebody who is very fast paced and okay with taking risks is naturally going to clash with somebody who needs time to consider and analyze and look at all the options and be more risk adverse, right? So within this book, he talks about all of these different types. So as you come down below the red, the yellow group, the influentials, right, their tendency is to be seen as enthusiastic. They're very optimistic and creative people. They really are great at thinking up big ideas. They really love to innovate. But on the flip side of that, right, sometimes they can appear to others as being overly confident. And perhaps sometimes they talk too much because of all this enthusiasm and excitement. They can come off to other groups as people who don't listen very well, and that they could be almost unfocused, going after the next shiny thing, right? So as you start to think about these strengths, which is what's listed on the slide here, you can sometimes see like how overusing a strength can start to rub the other styles the wrong way. And finally, we'll see the green category, people who are seen as more diplomatic. They're very caring and they're usually tuned in. It's like the office therapist type, right? People come to them because they just naturally feel comfortable sharing information with them. They tend to be pretty empathetic, but they're also really reliable and trustworthy, right? But the dark side of the green style is that they can be seen as also complacent or disengaged and change adverse. And sometimes, people feel like they can kind of walk over them or they might be doormats, right? So each style has its superpowers and they also have some downsides. And depending on your style preference, there are other tendencies from other people that can really start to be annoying. So I want to bring this to your attention as well, because as you recognize your own tendencies, being able to see how other people operate, it might help you adjust behaviors temporarily to make it easier for the other styles to work with you as well. So we call it like flexing your style. So I happen to be part of the red family. Um, and I kind of drive things forward. And the pitfall of that is sometimes I don't consider all of the data, and I may not consider all of the points of view that really would help me because by nature I've got my blinders on and I might miss details that are important to the outcome. So I have to learn to pump the brakes on myself and reach out to people like the blues, right, who have maybe seen historical information to help kind of reel me back in. But sometimes also as I'm dialed into the straight line path, I might not see like better options that the yellows might help me see because they are thinking big picture, and they by nature think outside the box. Right. And then finally, I can go to the greens to check myself, because they can help me understand the impact of what I'm trying to do on the rest of the team, the different stakeholders, right? So when it works well, and when you understand your own kind of pitfalls, the other colors can really help you do better. But just also understanding that if you find yourself getting into clashes, think about whether it's really a style-based thing as opposed to a true disagreement on the facts of the issues. And I find that if we end up in violent agreement over something, it's usually a style-based issue as opposed to something that is truly based on like not liking somebody or not liking their idea. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions or reactions that have popped up uh, in chat or via the Q&A.
It looks like there's a question on, is it possible to be blue and red? Can you be a little bit of both?
Yes, yes. There's actually shades of every color, I think, in most people. I think there are, I'm trying to remember what the book said. I think it was somewhere between 10 to 15% of the population that when they take a test for this would be just one color. But most of us are two or even three of this. And so it's, again, I think not a one note thing, but you'll tend to notice that there is one color that tends to be your like home base and your like your main area. And that's the one that you generally want to try and catch to do the adjustments of yourself, if that makes sense.
There's another question down
Let's
here. Would you use emotional intelligence in overcoming a difference in style?
Absolutely. And I love that question because just being able to recognize that somebody else has a different style preference than you is actually demonstrating emotional intelligence. EQ has many components of it. One is self-awareness. So we kind of hit that with mindset, but also knowing your own style is part of that self-awareness piece of it. After that, being able to read the room essentially and assess the style preferences of other people is another big piece of emotional intelligence. And so as you start to recognize those things, that's also another piece. And then finally, being willing to adjust your behavior to make it easier for everyone to work is, I think, a great example of the platinum rule at work. But again, I think the expression of emotional intelligence for sure. Yes, and it really does come with intention. So I think from this awareness, you know, now you have some additional choices in terms of like, hey, maybe I feel like I'm dealing with somebody who's of the yellow influential group, right? So my natural tendency may be to just be very direct, but in supporting somebody that's influential or yellow, I might allow them more time to brainstorm, to think out loud and things like that, even though internally I might be feeling this pressure of like, okay, we've got deadlines, let's make a decision and go. They may want to talk out like all of the possibilities and kind of imagine that future together. So giving them space to do that really, really would help. And I really appreciate Deborah providing a little bit more context to what the platinum rule is. Very great. All right, so any other reactions or questions? I'll just pause there and give people some time to react. All right, don't think I saw anything else. So in the interest of time, I think we've got another poll coming up. So I'm just kind of curious to see what makeup we have within our group of, wow, we're almost 100 people now. Do you think you are the red dominant type, the yellow influential, green diplomatic, or blue analytical? Or maybe a combination. Or we're going to force you to pick one for polling purposes. All right. And while we do the poll, Alicia has a question. What if the person is taking things personally and not necessarily based on style? Yeah, I think that's a really great lead in into our next segment, because even though It might be a style-based clash at its root. Um, it is true, right? We are emotional beings, and they might take things personally, like especially if they feel like they've not been listened to. It can still be something that feels hurtful, even though the root cause may be a style-based difference. So I think it's really important that even though you recognize these differences and you make some slight adjustments, it's still important sometimes to have that conversation with the person to clear the air, and get to a place where you both can move on and hopefully have a stronger working relationship after you get past the initial conflict. So hang on to that piece. I think I will have a framework that can be helpful to you. All right, so it looks like we have a pretty good representation across the styles, and it's actually pretty close to what I would expect. I think generally speaking, it is pretty evenly distributed amongst the styles. We do have a slight tip to the analytical types within this, within our particular group, but that's really, really cool to see. All right. Thank you, Megan, for sharing the results of the poll with everyone in chat. All right. So mentioned earlier to Alicia's question, why have this conversation, right? I think it's sometimes easier to just avoid it because it's unpleasant and uncomfortable. But there's a quote from Susan Scott's book, Fierce Conversations, that this framework is based on, where she says, while no single conversation is guaranteed to change the trajectory of a career, a company, or even a relationship, any single conversation can, right? So you just never know when that conversation turns to be like the pivot point to something much greater and much better. So I highly recommend that book because honestly, it has really helped me tremendously approach confrontations. It's not something I naturally felt good at, and certainly from my cultural upbringing, it was like you never challenged authority, right? So this was a really great book that helped me. So here's basically four things that can be served by having the courage to approach these confrontational conversations. First, it's interrogating reality, right? We all have our lens and the way that we've seen things, but the other party also has a point of view, and they may know things that we are not aware of. So just remembering that we only have part of the story, and it's important in the conversation to be listening for that other part of the story. And that's what we mean by interrogating reality, right? We know what we see, they bring to the table what they've seen, and then together you have a better picture of what really is going on. The second is provoking learning. So you want to be able to guide people to see the impact of their own behaviors, and hopefully through some level of self-discovery and not you just pointing the finger or assigning blame, right? So it is about having questions within your arsenal that invite them to reflect, right? Things like, how do you think others experience your input in meetings, right? Rather than just saying, I think you talk too much in meetings, right? It's a very different way of approaching things that I think makes it more open and conversational as opposed to something that's accusatory. And then the third bullet here is, ultimately you do want something to change, right? Otherwise you wouldn't be having the conversation. And so addressing behaviors directly but respectfully is another goal of having this conversation. So avoid the triangulation where it's like you talk about other people to others, but not to the person themselves, right? So again, bringing it directly to them, and being clear about your intentions. So it could sound something like this. I need to talk to you about how your tone in the email is affecting the team, right? Keeping it about observable behaviors is also another way to avoid getting into, roundabout arguments about stuff, right? It's hard to argue that you didn't behave a certain way, because I might have actually said something in a meeting. So if you quoted that to me, it'd be really hard to argue. But if instead you said, well, you were being rude, now I can argue, right? I'm like, I wasn't being rude. I was just pointing out blah, blah, blah. So I think as you address behaviors and be very objective in describing that, again, it also helps the conversation stay on track. And then finally, end discussions by reaffirming the respect and goal of working well together. So it is, again, coming back to like, I know this is really awkward, but I value your perspective and want us to collaborate more effectively. And just kind of reiterate why it is that you're having this kind of awkward and difficult conversation is really important too. So ultimately, you're doing this in service of the relationship in the longer term, as opposed to just, staying away from it, because in the short term, it might be easier to just not say anything. Yeah. All right. I think we have one more poll question coming up. So I'm just kind of curious, when it comes to confrontation today, what is your typical kind of reaction to it? Do you feel underprepared? Do you generally want to avoid it? Or do you feel actually okay actually having these conversations? All right. And while
I
you
think
are
we have a
doing the poll,
question.
sure. What's the question?
It says, what do I do when I realize my style is the different style? So everyone thinks I'm the problem and aren't always open to self-reflection.
Gotcha. So you're like in a room full of people of a different style. Yeah. And I find it's also unfair for you to always have to flex to other people's style. But I think one, I would say a little bit of sharing this information to say, look, I've learned that I have this particular style and I have a tendency to do this. And sharing with them that they might have differences can help at least them come to the middle a little bit towards you. Naki, I'm curious if you would be willing to share what your style is. So it'd be easier for me to provide an example of what I call a style trade. Um, Analytical. Okay. So maybe everyone else is, ready to like go ahead and make a decision, but you're like, I still think we need a little bit more data or information. Um, and I think sharing some of that is going to be fine, because your intention is to say, look, I don't want to hold back progress, but I also want to make sure that we're not jumping in and causing more problems for ourselves down the road when we can avoid it. So sometimes just sharing this information and where you're coming from and what's going on in your head can really help people understand that you're not saying no to an idea because you don't like the idea itself. It's just like, yeah, there's a couple things I want us to look at. So I think sharing your thinking is an important piece of it. But the other is, again, sometimes you're like, okay, what are some things that I can do to feel a little bit more comfortable with moving a little bit faster to the decision that the group is, right? So I think there's a little bit of compromise in there, but it all begins with sharing your thinking. Um, Gabriella, I see you also have a question about when someone's aware of their style but uses it as an excuse for behavior, rather than using it in a good way. Um, for sure. I think this is where, again, they try to weaponize that. Um, I think it comes back to this conversational model too, about saying like, hey, when you act this way, the impact is XYZ, right? Whatever you're observing, it's like it's not having the intended impact. And you can still lay it to them to say, well, it's not okay for you to just ignore the opinions of others, for example, because they have valid ideas, or again, whatever the reasons are, I think you can still lay that out to them and point out their behaviors. All right. So with this group, is really encouraging. It looks like almost half of you are kind of okay with having it and or at least comfortable. So I would say if you found something that's helpful to you, please feel free to use the chat to share a little bit of those insights as well, because we're all having to deal with these situations. And if you found something that's been helpful, please share it with the group so that the others who feel less prepared uh, can benefit from your knowledge. All right. Yes. Deborah, I think I love this. It's wondering out loud. I think also another framework that's worked really well for me is what I call the likes, concerns, and suggestions format. So when you feel like people are moving on too quickly. I think the likes piece of it shares that you're acknowledging the merits of the idea and you're not just shooting it down. So they feel a little bit of validation in it. Your concerns then maybe, okay, here's where I think you are diving in way too quickly or missing something. And then the suggestions allows you to be constructive. So rather than being seen as a force of slowing things down, where you have suggestions, now it's like, hey, I want to help you. Let me build on this idea, but hopefully that also relieves some of your tension and concerns as well. So I find that that's another structure to layer in your feedback in those situations. Awesome. All right. Well, Megan, please keep me honest if new questions come up, but I do want to share the principles of fierce conversations that I've kind of borrowed from Susan Scott, because I really do think the book was really helpful to me. So here's what you'd want to do. The first is what she says, mastering the courage to interrogate reality. So this is just a reminder to not dance around the issues, uh, and be candid in approaching these people. So as an example, let's say you have somebody who's just being passive aggressive. Go ahead and state what you've noticed and then ask for their perspective. And I think that's the part about interrogating reality, is making sure that after you share your observation, make space for them to share theirs, and then, be quiet yourself. I think that's the hard part. But here's an example, right? The passive aggressive. You might say something like, you agreed to the deadline, but it seems that there's frustration underneath. What's happening? Right? So it is kind of a two-part thing of sharing what you see or hear. And sometimes it may not be something they directly say, but you can just tell from facial expressions, right? Like, it seems like you are concerned about something. What's going on for you? Right? And just making sure that you invite that other perspective in with a good question. All right. So that's step one. Step two is coming out from behind yourself and making it real. So again, it's like dropping the corporate politeness, and being authentic. So it's really about saying what's true, even if it feels uncomfortable, right? And sometimes it's being able to say something like, "Hey, I'm concerned about our communication, that it's become strained, and I want to find ways to repair that." So, finding in it yourself to be able to call out the elephant in the room is really at the heart of what number two is about. All right. Number three, I think, is critically important, and it's really about having your physical and mental focus being in that conversation. Uh, we're all busy. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of frustrations and worries, to be sure, right? But as you are having that conversation, making sure that you are actually listening to what the other person is sharing is going to be a huge difference maker. So make sure you give them your full attention, because I think oftentimes people uh, who feel like they're difficult, they really need to be heard, or maybe they're being difficult because they don't feel like people are really understanding them. So acknowledging their point of view is a really powerful way of I think, diffusing some of these situations as well. So even if you don't necessarily agree with their point, being able to demonstrate that you understand their point is a big thing, right? So I'd say that is at the core of step 3. Step 4 is about tackling your toughest challenge today. So this is also about, again, don't postpone these conversations. I think a saying that that stuck with me is that, feedback, right, about behaviors that are not productive. Like feedback is best delivered fresh. Uh, so, because it's like fish, got to be fresh. Because if you think about all the drawbacks that could happen if you wait too long to have the conversation, is, both of your and their memory of the incident gets foggier with time. All right. So you might find yourself with more room for interpretation. You remember things differently. And sometimes it might feel like a gotcha as well. It's like, well, why did you wait this long to confront me about this? Right. We could have addressed it. We could have fixed things. And so it's a kind of a reminder that don't let things fester. As you start to see things start to come apart, make sure you address it up front. All right. So the number 5 here is about obeying your instincts. And so sometimes you just have a gut feeling that says, a pattern that you're seeing is not helping the team. And it's really about addressing it, even if you haven't gotten concrete proof that it's damaging the team dynamic. Like you just know in your gut that something's amiss, and you don't want it to get to a point where it's obvious that it's a problem, right? Ideally, you would want to solve things early before it becomes really bad. So I think sometimes it is about trusting your gut. Say, look, I should say something now rather than later. All right. Number 6, taking responsibility for your emotional wake. So this one I think is really linked to what I said earlier about mindset. And so making sure that your tone maintains a respectful note. And I find that people will mirror your energy. And so if you find that they start to push back on what you're telling them, just recognize that it's a very natural reaction, right? If you were standing somewhere and someone pushed against you, you would find that naturally you were inclined to push back. So when you start to feel that, it's time for you to kind of, again, take a step back, acknowledge the point of view, and then remain respectful as you kind of think about what you might say in return. Right. But this is where, again, trying to maintain that right mindset can help you a ton in keeping that conversation constructive and professional. And then I'd say the last one was a huge unlock for me because I used to think you'd have to go into this conversation with like, a 5-point dissertation about all the things that you want to say, the points you want to, make, evidence you've gathered. But again, it is a conversation. And therefore, you don't need to do all the talking. After stating something that's been difficult, maybe you said, hey, I've observed that our team dynamic and the communications have really broken down. And I'm curious if you see the same thing. Just stop talking, take a deep breath, and let the person think about how they might want to respond. I think in these difficult circumstances, the more uncomfortable the conversation is, I feel like the more our nervous mind wants to fill the space. But when you are laying something like this on somebody that they might not have expected, they need some time to process what you've just told them. And so I say like on principle 7 here is to make sure you take a long, deep breath, give them plenty of space and time to think about what they want to say back to you, and resist the urge to say more until they've had a chance to share. All right. I'll pause there. Megan, have there been any new questions?
I don't see any in the chat, but I have one if you have a second. I was
Of course.
wondering about email. So many of us don't work in the same places now. Email is a lot of our communication. How can you make sure that your email has the right message? Because as you were saying before, tone can get kind of lost in person and often in email. So, what would you recommend?
For sure. And I think even the style preferences creep into emails, right? So some of it may be assessing your audience. If you know your recipient is somebody who really appreciates, let's just say the recipient is green, for example, somebody who really wants to make sure that the team is on board with a particular idea or that you've considered how it's going to impact other stakeholders, then I would make sure that even in your email communication, you kind of acknowledge those things. And I think also providing them time to like digest the information, because the greens have a tendency to need a little bit more time to come to terms with, especially if it's something that is a change. That in your email, it's like, okay, I'm going to give you time to pre-read and then you could come talk to me with your questions. I think those are things that you can do even in written format to make it a little bit easier for them to absorb information. Um, I think especially if you think about the blues and greens, both of those styles tend to be a little bit slower paced in decision making, and they need time to formulate their responses. And so I think coming back to, again, giving them space to process information, especially if it's like a pre-read. I think even if you invite them into a conversation later via Teams or a virtual format, they're probably going to be more prepared to engage with you rather than you just, hitting call on Teams and saying, "Hey, can we talk now?" So those are some layers where I think the style comes into play. I hope that helps.
I love that. I just know that sometimes messages can get lost, and we definitely don't want that, especially since we're talking about challenging coworkers. So, I don't
Mhm.
see any other questions right now. I'm going to go ahead and launch our last poll. But I wanted to ask you, let's get your top takeaway. If nobody takes anything else from um, this conference, this session, this breakout, what would be the one top takeaway you want them to take with them?
I always say that it's, again, being willing to have a true conversation, is really at the heart of it. And I think the hardest part is if you're dealing with somebody difficult, um, truly listening to them and acknowledging their points of view can feel like taking, I don't know, a spoonful of liver oil. It's not pleasant. But it's so important to the relationship to be willing to set aside, your agenda momentarily so that you can take in their point of view fully. And I find that when people see you willingness to do this, they're also more willing to hear you out in return. And so you stop the shoving match and you start working towards something where you both can feel a little bit better about the outcome. Yeah.
I love that. That's so meaningful. And just one more time, what was that book that you recommended in case people missed it and they want to jot it down and go grab it?
Fierce Conversations. And it's by Susan Scott.
Perfect,
And I
perfect.
think it's just a wonderful book, very practical. And I think she's got a lot of great examples within there, stories of people that she's worked with, conversations that she's had. And then I found that there's also a lot of examples of how you can start difficult conversations. And so there's a lot of different circumstances where I'm like, well, I wonder what words I would use, or what questions I would ask, right, to invite the other person's point of view. And I found that there were just so many great nuggets within her book, that I kind of copied over so that, again, like as I started the conversation, at least I knew the first few things I wanted to say, um, to invite the person in. And I didn't have to worry about figuring that piece out too. All right. Well, thank you so much for responding to the poll. I feel validated that many of you found it at least helpful or intriguing and that you feel somewhat better prepared to handle difficult people. I will say that it is never easy, unfortunately. These are not the funnest things to do. But I will say also that with some of these relationships that I've had, with my board of directors, for example, where it started out very contentious, and I just felt like initially I was like, they're not giving me a chance. Um, I took the time to work with them, and it has now become one of the more supportive relations that I've had, where again, they are very different from me stylistically, but they also help me be better because they cover for the inherent weaknesses that I have in my personal style. So it's worthwhile. Um, but I just want to remind you too that even though you might be armed with better tools, and the preparation, it still feels awkward. I haven't figured out a way around that piece of it yet either. So it does take courage to do. All right. So I know we have a few more minutes. I am happy to stick around for any additional reactions or questions. Otherwise, I know, Megan, we have a lot of amazing sponsors that we should acknowledge for the program today.
We absolutely do. We definitely want to thank WEPA and Pluralsight, Code for America, and the National Association of Government Communications. They help us put on NextGen, and we are so excited that they were available to do that. So thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to everyone who participated. This was such a great chat and lots of good interactions. I do have a few quick reminders before we log off of this session. You guys stayed, you participated in the polls, you did all of the things. So don't forget to fill out your CPE evaluations because you don't want to miss that credit. You've earned it. Be sure to head over to the exhibit hall to check out our amazing booth. There's lots of good resources. You can interact with folks and it's a good time. They've got all sorts of resources. And don't forget that up next, our lunchtime keynotes are at 12:30. We've got some really good speakers there. We've got Tracy DeMartini and Erica Roberts. We've got some really hot topics that you won't want to miss. So be sure to access the sessions in the session tab in the main environment. And we will see you next time. Thanks again for participating and coming to NextGen. We know that you could spend your day in other ways, but we're glad that you're here with us.